3 days later, Maria submitted a formal offer of $47,000 cash, with a letter explaining her family's situation and commitment to restoring the property as a working ranch and permanent home. She expected rejection, or at least lengthy negotiations, but the bank's response came within 24 hours, accepting her offer with a 30-day closing timeline that left her simultaneously elated and terrified about the magnitude of the commitment she'd just made. The following weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, loan applications, insurance arrangements, and practical preparations for a move that would completely transform their daily lives. Eduardo assembled a crew of friends willing to work weekends on the house renovation in exchange for meals and modest payment when money became available. Carmen offered to help with childcare during the transition, and even their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gonzalez, volunteered to drive out periodically to check on their progress and bring supplies from town. The closing took place on a Friday morning, in early November, with Maria signing documents in the law office while trying to suppress both excitement and panic about the financial risk she was taking. By that afternoon, she stood in the empty adobe house, holding the keys to 320 acres of Sonoran desert, wondering if she'd made the most courageous decision of her life or the most foolish mistake she'd ever recover from. "It's really ours?" Diego asked that first evening as they ate takeout pizza on the living room floor, flashlights providing the only illumination since the electricity wouldn't be connected until the following week. Through the broken windows, they could see more stars than any of them had ever imagined existed, a brilliant canopy of light stretching from horizon to horizon without a single building or streetlight to diminish its magnificence. "It's really ours," Maria confirmed, pulling both boys close to her as they listened to the profound silence of the desert night, broken only by the distant call of a coyote and the gentle whisper of wind through the ancient saguaro cacti that had stood guard over this land for centuries before any of them were born. The first month was a crash course in ranch life, desert survival, and construction work that pushed Maria's endurance and problem-solving skills to their absolute limits. Eduardo and his crew worked weekends to make the house weatherproof and habitable, installing new windows, repairing the roof, and creating functional plumbing in one bathroom while leaving the rest of the house for future renovation as funds became available. Maria drove to town 3 times a week for groceries and supplies, gradually learning which roads were passable after rain and how to navigate by landmarks when GPS signals failed in the remote canyons. The boys adapted to their new environment, with the resilience of childhood, quickly learning to identify poisonous plants and dangerous animals while discovering the joy of exploration in a landscape that offered new adventures every day. Their small rural school, with only 40 students in 6 grades, provided individual attention and outdoor education programs that would have been impossible in urban settings. Diego developed a passionate interest in desert ecology, while Mateo surprised everyone by displaying natural artistic talent in sketching the dramatic landscapes surrounding their new home. By December, with basic habitability achieved and the boys settled into their new school routine, Maria turned her attention to the broader ranch property that stretched beyond their immediate living area. The previous owners had left behind decades of accumulated debris, abandoned equipment, and sections of broken fencing that would need to be cleared and repaired before the land could support any kind of agricultural operation. Her long-term vision included restoring native vegetation, possibly raising a few head of cattle, and creating a sustainable homestead that could provide both food security and modest income through farmers' market sales or agritourism. The work was physically demanding but strangely satisfying in ways that her restaurant management job had never been. Instead of dealing with difficult customers, inventory shortages, and corporate policies that seemed designed to maximize profits at the expense of both employees and food quality. Maria found herself learning practical skills that directly improved her family's living situation. She taught herself basic carpentry from YouTube videos, practiced welding with equipment borrowed from Eduardo, and developed an intuitive understanding of desert hydrology by observing how water moved across the landscape during the occasional winter rains. The financial pressure remained constant but manageable as long as she maintained her restaurant job and carefully budgeted every expense. The drive to work in Tucson took 45 minutes each way, but the cost savings in housing more than compensated for the additional fuel expenses. More importantly, the boys were thriving in ways that would have been impossible in their previous urban environment, developing confidence, independence, and practical skills that no classroom could teach. It was during this period of cautious optimism that Maria began experiencing strange dreams that seemed more like memories than typical nighttime fantasies. She found herself walking through landscapes that looked familiar, despite being places she'd never visited, following paths that felt ancient and purposeful, guided by voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand but somehow recognized at a deeper level. Her grandmother's stories, which had seemed like quaint folklore during Maria's urban childhood, began taking on new relevance as she developed her own relationship with the desert ecosystem. The dreams became more frequent and vivid as winter progressed, often featuring an elderly woman who looked remarkably like Maria's great-grandmother in old family photographs, gesturing toward specific locations on the ranch property and speaking urgently in what sounded like a mixture of Spanish and an indigenous language that Maria couldn't identify. Upon waking, she found herself drawn to explore the exact areas from her dreams, though she told herself this was simply coincidence rather than any kind of supernatural guidance. One particularly intense dream in late January left Maria with an overwhelming compulsion to investigate a specific hillside area about half a mile from the house, where erosion had created a natural amphitheater surrounded by ancient mesquite trees and towering saguaro cacti. She'd walked past this area dozens of times during her property surveys, but had never paid particular attention to what appeared to be simply another section of desert landscape gradually surrendering to the effects of wind and rain. This time, however, something caught her eye that she'd previously overlooked completely. What she'd assumed were natural rock formations, partially buried by decades of accumulated soil and desert debris, showed subtle but unmistakable signs of human construction. The stones were arranged in patterns too regular to be coincidental, with straight edges and corner joints that suggested deliberate architecture rather than random geological processes. Maria spent the better part of a Saturday morning carefully clearing away brush and accumulated sediment from what appeared to be the outline of ancient walls, working with hand tools to avoid damaging whatever lay beneath the surface. The boys helped enthusiastically, treating the excavation as an exciting treasure hunt, while Maria tried to contain her own growing excitement about what they might be uncovering. By early afternoon, they had revealed approximately 20 feet of what was clearly a constructed stone wall, built with carefully fitted blocks that showed sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. The construction technique seemed incredibly old, predating anything Maria had learned about in Arizona history classes, yet the materials and methods suggested a level of architectural knowledge that contradicted common assumptions about prehistoric southwestern cultures. "Mom, look at this!" Diego called out from the far end of their excavation area, where he'd been working with a small brush to clear soil from between stones. "There are pictures carved into the rock." Indeed, careful cleaning revealed petroglyphs, Etched into several of the stone blocks, images of spirals, animal figures, and geometric patterns that were clearly intentional artistic or symbolic representations rather than natural markings. The discovery sent chills down Maria's spine, not from fear, but from a profound sense of recognition that she couldn't rationally explain. The petroglyphs seemed familiar in the same way that the landscape in her dreams had felt familiar, as if she was reconnecting with something that had always been part of her heritage, but had been forgotten through generations of urban living and cultural assimilation. That evening, after carefully photographing their discoveries and covering the exposed stonework to protect it from potential weather damage, Maria called her sister Carmen to share the news. Carmen's reaction was immediate and concerned. "Maria, you need to be very careful about this. If you found some kind of archaeological site, there could be legal complications. The government has all sorts of rules about disturbing Native American artifacts and burial grounds." The warning introduced anxiety that Maria hadn't previously considered. Her research into property ownership had focused on financial and legal basics, not on potential archaeological implications of land use. A quick internet search revealed that Carmen's concerns were well-founded. The Archaeological Resources Protection Act, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and various other federal and state laws created complex regulatory frameworks for handling discovered cultural artifacts and sites. Worse, these regulations could potentially supersede private property rights in cases where significant archaeological or cultural resources were involved. Maria's dream of creating a stable home for her family could be jeopardized if government agencies decided to assert jurisdiction over her land, based on whatever lay buried beneath that hillside. The practical dilemma was complicated by ethical considerations that Maria found equally troubling. If her property contained significant Native American cultural sites, did she have moral obligations that transcended her legal property rights? Her grandmother's stories had always emphasized the family's indigenous heritage, though the specific tribal connections had been lost through generations of intermarriage and geographic displacement during the various periods of forced relocation that had scattered southwestern Native communities throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. On the other hand, Maria had invested everything she owned in this property specifically to create security and stability for her sons. The financial risks she'd taken were justified only if she maintained full control over the land use and development decisions. Government intervention, regardless of its cultural or archaeological merits, could potentially destroy the economic foundation she'd worked so hard to establish. The internal conflict kept Maria awake for several nights, weighing competing values and trying to determine the right course of action. Her restaurant job provided sufficient income to cover basic living expenses, but only barely, and any disruption to her property rights could force them back into the cycle of rising rents and housing insecurity that had driven her to take such dramatic risks in the first place. Meanwhile, the dreams continued with increasing intensity and specificity. The elderly woman who appeared consistently in these visions began seeming less like a product of Maria's subconscious imagination and more like an actual person trying to communicate urgent information. In the most recent and vivid dream, the woman had led Maria to the exact location where they'd discovered the stone walls, then pointed insistently toward other areas of the property while speaking rapidly in that mysterious language that felt familiar despite being incomprehensible. Upon waking from this particular dream, Maria found herself possessed by knowledge she couldn't have acquired through normal means. She knew with inexplicable certainty that the stone walls they'd uncovered were only a small portion of a much larger complex that extended throughout the hillside area. She knew that certain other locations on her property contained related structures and artifacts that had been deliberately concealed or abandoned centuries ago. Most disturbingly, she knew that these sites held cultural and spiritual significance that went far beyond simple archaeological interest. The knowledge felt inherited rather than learned, as if genetic memory was finally asserting itself after generations of dormancy. Maria found herself remembering her great-grandmother's stories with new clarity and understanding, recognizing that what she'd dismissed as folklore might actually be family history, preserved through oral tradition. The desert landscape that had initially seemed harsh and alien now felt like home, in a way that transcended her recent purchase of the property deed. This sense of ancestral connection created new urgency around the question of whether to report her discoveries to authorities or continue investigating privately. If her family did have historical ties to the people who had created these structures, then her relationship to the site was more complex than simple property ownership. But proving such connections would likely require involving exactly the academic and governmental institutions that could potentially claim jurisdiction over her land. The dilemma intensified when Diego made another significant discovery during their weekend excavation work. While carefully clearing soil from the base of the main stone wall, he uncovered what appeared to be a partially buried entrance or doorway, lined with carefully fitted stones and extending downward into darkness that suggested substantial underground construction. "There's a whole room down there," Diego reported excitedly, shining his flashlight into the opening. "I can see walls and maybe stairs going deeper." Maria peered into the passage, feeling the same inexplicable recognition that had accompanied all of their previous discoveries. The underground chamber wasn't just archaeologically significant. It felt personally familiar, as if she'd walked through it countless times, in dreams she couldn't quite remember. The entrance was too narrow for adult exploration without significant excavation, but large enough to confirm that they'd discovered something far more complex than simple surface structures. The implications were simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. If the site contained extensive underground chambers and potentially valuable artifacts, the legal and cultural complications would multiply exponentially. That night, Maria made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of their new life on the ranch. Before involving any outside authorities, she would conduct a thorough private investigation of the site to understand exactly what they'd discovered and to research her family's potential connections to the people who had originally built these structures. Only with complete information could she make informed decisions about how to balance her responsibilities as a property owner, her obligations as someone who might have inherited cultural stewardship, and her primary duty to protect her sons' future security. The decision felt both reasonable and dangerous, opening possibilities for discovery and understanding, while potentially creating legal vulnerabilities that could threaten everything she'd worked to build. But as she stood on her front porch that evening, looking out over the desert landscape that increasingly felt like ancestral territory rather than simply purchased property, Maria realized that her relationship to this land had already evolved beyond simple real estate investment into something that demanded courage, wisdom, and respect for forces much larger than her immediate personal concerns. The following morning, Maria called in sick to the restaurant for the first time since moving to the ranch, telling her manager she had a family emergency that required immediate attention. The lie felt justified given the magnitude of what they'd discovered and the urgent need to understand the full scope of the archaeological site before making any irreversible decisions about involving outside authorities. She arranged for the boys to spend the day with Carmen in town, explaining that she needed to handle some complicated property issues that were better addressed without curious 8-year-olds asking questions that she wasn't yet prepared to answer. Alone on the ranch, for the first time since the purchase, Maria gathered proper excavation tools borrowed from Eduardo's construction supplies, along with flashlights, measuring tape, and her digital camera to document whatever they might find in the underground chamber. The desert morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant sunshine that made the previous night's anxieties seem overblown and manageable. Standing at the partially excavated entrance, she felt a mixture of scientific curiosity and spiritual anticipation that reminded her of childhood Christmas mornings when mysterious packages held the promise of wonderful surprises. The entrance proved more accessible than it had appeared the previous day. Careful removal of loose soil and small rocks widened the opening sufficiently to allow adult passage, revealing stone steps that descended approximately 8 feet into a circular chamber carved directly into the hillside's bedrock. The construction quality was extraordinary, with precisely fitted stone blocks creating walls that had remained structurally sound despite centuries of abandonment. The chamber's ceiling featured a sophisticated corbelled arch that distributed weight evenly while creating a sense of spaciousness despite the underground location. Most remarkably, the walls were covered with elaborate petroglyphs that extended far beyond the simple animal and geometric figures they discovered on the exterior stones. These interior carvings depicted complex scenes that appeared to tell stories or record significant events, with human figures engaged in ceremonial activities, astronomical observations, and agricultural practices that suggested sophisticated cultural development. The artistic style was consistent throughout, indicating either a single artist working over an extended period or multiple artists trained in the same traditional techniques. The chamber's floor contained features that clearly indicated specialized purposes beyond simple storage or shelter. A circular depression in the center, lined with fire-blackened stones, had obviously served as a hearth or ceremonial fire pit. Around the perimeter, carefully carved niches in the walls held pottery vessels, stone tools, and other artifacts that appeared to have been deliberately placed rather than accidentally abandoned. Most intriguingly, a narrow passage at the far end of the chamber led deeper into the hillside, suggesting that this room was merely the entrance to a more extensive underground complex. As Maria photographed and measured the chamber's features, she found herself overwhelmed by the sense that she was documenting not just archaeological artifacts, but family history that had been preserved specifically for her to rediscover. The petroglyphs seemed to tell familiar stories, and the overall layout of the space felt intuitively logical in ways that suggested inherited understanding rather than academic analysis. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper explanations for ceremonial objects and symbolic representations that would have been incomprehensible to someone without cultural connections to their original creators. The pottery vessels, when examined closely with a flashlight, revealed sophisticated, decorative techniques and functional designs that indicated highly developed ceramic traditions. Several pieces showed signs of ritual use, with residues that might once have held sacred substances or ceremonial foods. The stone tools included not only practical implements for daily life, but also specialized instruments that appeared designed for astronomical observation, medical procedures, or religious ceremonies that required precise cutting or carving capabilities. Most significantly, one of the wall niches contained a collection of smaller stones covered with petroglyphs that appeared to function as portable records or messages. These stones seemed to document astronomical events, seasonal ceremonies, and historical incidents that connected this site to a broader network of related locations throughout the Southwest. The implications suggested that Maria's property had served as more than just a local gathering place. It had been a significant center within a sophisticated cultural system that extended across tribal and geographic boundaries. The narrow passage leading deeper into the hillside required careful navigation, but opened into a second chamber that was even more elaborate than the first. This room featured a raised platform at one end, clearly designed for ceremonial purposes, with intricate carvings that depicted creation stories, spiritual beings, and ritual practices that would have been central to the religious life of whoever had built this complex. The ceiling in this chamber was higher, with a natural opening that allowed limited daylight to filter down from the surface, creating dramatic lighting effects that would have enhanced the spiritual atmosphere during ceremonies. Along the walls of this second chamber, stone shelves held collections of artifacts that represented the most sophisticated cultural achievements Maria had yet discovered. Elaborately decorated pottery, including pieces that appeared to be purely ceremonial, rather than functional, demonstrated artistic skills that rivaled museum collections she'd seen in major southwestern archaeological exhibits. Stone sculptures, some recognizably representing animals or human figures, while others embodied abstract spiritual concepts, showed mastery of carving techniques that required both technical skill and deep cultural knowledge. The most extraordinary discovery in this ceremonial chamber was a collection of what appeared to be astronomical calculation devices, stone discs and tablets with precisely carved markings that corresponded to celestial movements and seasonal cycles. These instruments suggested that the site's inhabitants had possessed mathematical and observational capabilities that enabled accurate prediction of eclipses, solstices, and other astronomical events that would have been crucial for agricultural, timing, and religious ceremonies. As Maria documented these discoveries, photographing each artifact from multiple angles and measuring the chamber's dimensions, she began to understand that she had stumbled upon one of the most significant, undisturbed Native American ceremonial sites in the Southwest. The sophistication of the construction, the artistic quality of the artifacts, and the evident importance of the site within its original cultural context indicated that this complex had served as a major religious and social center for a substantial population over many generations. The realization brought both excitement and terror. The archaeological value of the site was undoubtedly immense, potentially revolutionizing academic understanding of pre-Columbian southwestern cultures and their technological capabilities. But that same significance meant that government agencies, universities, and tribal representatives would inevitably become involved once the discovery became public knowledge, potentially ending Maria's control over her own property and threatening the stable home she'd worked so desperately to create for her sons. More personally troubling was her growing certainty that her family's connection to this site was not coincidental. The sense of familiarity she felt with the ceremonial objects, the intuitive understanding of the site's layout and purposes, and the increasing vividness of her dreams all suggested that her great-grandmother's stories about their family's indigenous heritage were more than folklore. If her ancestors had been among the people who had built and used this ceremonial complex, then her discovery represented not just archaeological significance, but cultural homecoming. The ethical implications of this possibility were complex and emotionally challenging. If she did have ancestral connections to the site's original inhabitants, did she have obligations to contemporary tribal communities who might claim cultural or spiritual jurisdiction over the artifacts and ceremonial spaces? How could she balance respect for indigenous cultural rights with her need to maintain the property ownership that provided security for her children? These questions became more urgent when Maria discovered evidence that the site had been deliberately concealed rather than simply abandoned. In several locations, stone blocks had been carefully arranged to hide entrances and camouflage the complex's existence from casual observation. Pottery and other valuable artifacts had been strategically placed in protected niches where they would be preserved but not easily discovered by unauthorized visitors. The overall arrangement suggested that the site's inhabitants had taken great care to ensure that their sacred spaces and ceremonial objects would remain intact until appropriate people could return to reclaim them. The possibility that she might be one of those appropriate people felt both humbling and overwhelming. Maria had never considered herself particularly spiritual or culturally connected to indigenous traditions, having grown up in urban environments where such connections seemed largely irrelevant to daily survival. But standing in the ceremonial chamber, surrounded by artifacts that seemed to pulse with continuing spiritual significance, she felt the awakening of something that transcended her immediate practical concerns about property ownership and financial security. The afternoon passed quickly as Maria explored additional passages that branched off from the main ceremonial chamber, revealing smaller rooms that appeared to have served specialized functions within the overall religious complex. One chamber contained what appeared to be medical or healing equipment, stone tools, and pottery vessels that would have been used for preparing medicines or conducting healing ceremonies. Another room featured elaborate astronomical carvings on the walls and ceiling, mapping star patterns and planetary movements with precision that would have required generations of careful observation and mathematical calculation. Perhaps most significantly, Maria discovered a chamber that appeared to have served as a repository for historical records, containing stone tablets covered with petroglyphs that seemed to document important events, tribal histories, and genealogical information that connected this site to other locations throughout the Southwest. While she couldn't read the symbolic language used in these records, the artistic style and some of the recurring symbols looked remarkably similar to designs she remembered from her great-grandmother's jewelry and pottery, family heirlooms that had seemed like interesting decorative objects rather than culturally significant artifacts. As the sun began to set and Maria prepared to leave the underground complex, she made a decision that would prove pivotal to everything that followed. Instead of immediately contacting archaeological authorities or tribal representatives, she would spend the following weeks conducting careful private research to understand her family's potential connections to the site's original inhabitants. Only with that knowledge could she make informed decisions about how to handle the discovery in ways that honored both her obligations as a property owner and her possible responsibilities as someone with inherited cultural connections to the ceremonial complex. The decision felt both prudent and dangerous, buying time for crucial research while potentially creating legal vulnerabilities if government agencies learned about the site before she had established her cultural standing. But as Maria climbed out of the ceremonial chamber and carefully concealed the entrance to protect the site from weather and unauthorized visitors, she realized that her relationship to this land had already evolved far beyond simple property. Ownership into something that demanded wisdom, courage, and respect for forces much larger than her immediate personal concerns. That evening, after picking up the boys from Carmen's house and listening to their excited accounts of their day in town, Maria found herself looking at her sons with new eyes. If her growing suspicions about their family's heritage were correct, then Diego and Mateo were not just the children of a struggling single mother trying to make it in rural Arizona, but potential inheritors of cultural traditions and spiritual connections that stretched back centuries into the desert landscape that was becoming their home. The following weeks became a delicate balancing act between maintaining normal routines and conducting intensive research into her family's genealogical history. Maria returned to her restaurant management duties, but found herself distracted during slow periods, using her phone to search ancestry websites and genealogical databases for information about her maternal great-grandmother, Rosa Montoya, whose stories had always hinted at connections to indigenous communities that predated the Spanish colonial period in Arizona. The research proved more challenging than Maria had anticipated. Official records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries were sparse for indigenous families who had often deliberately avoided government documentation systems that were associated with forced relocations, boarding school policies, and other forms of cultural suppression. Many Native American families had adopted Spanish or Anglo surnames during periods when indigenous identity was actively persecuted, making it difficult to trace lineages through conventional genealogical methods. However, Maria's persistence began yielding intriguing results when she expanded her search to include oral history projects conducted by universities and tribal cultural preservation programs. The Tohono O'odham Nation's Cultural Center had digitized extensive collections of elder interviews, family stories, and historical accounts that included references to families who had lived in the area where Maria's ranch was now located. One particularly significant discovery came through a University of Arizona anthropology project that had recorded interviews with tribal elders in the 1970s. An elderly woman named Elena Montoya had provided detailed accounts of her grandmother's stories about sacred sites that had been deliberately concealed during the period of increased federal pressure on Native communities in the early 1900s. The interviewer had noted that Elena claimed her family had maintained knowledge of these hidden ceremonial locations despite being forced to relocate to official reservation boundaries. The surname connection was impossible to ignore, and Elena's physical description in the interview notes matched family photographs of Maria's great-grandmother with remarkable precision. More compelling were Elena's specific references to ceremonial complexes built into hillsides near natural water sources, with underground chambers designed for astronomical observations and seasonal ceremonies that connected multiple tribal communities across the Sonoran Desert region. Maria contacted the university's anthropology department, hoping to access more detailed information from Elena Montoya's interviews. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a cultural anthropologist specializing in southwestern indigenous communities, agreed to meet with Maria after learning about her potential family, connections, and property location. Their conversation in Dr. Hernandez's office, surrounded by maps, pottery fragments, and photographs of archaeological sites throughout Arizona, provided Maria with both crucial information and sobering warnings about the complexities she was navigating. Elena Montoya was one of our most valuable oral history sources, Dr. Hernandez explained, pulling out file folders containing transcripts and photographs from the 1970s interviews. She had an extraordinary memory for traditional stories and maintained connections to cultural practices that had been largely suppressed for decades. Her accounts of hidden ceremonial sites were particularly detailed, though we were never able to locate the specific locations she described. The transcripts contained Elena's descriptions of sites that matched Maria's discoveries with stunning accuracy. References to circular chambers with corbelled ceilings, ceremonial fire pits, astronomical calculation devices, and collections of sacred pottery that had been deliberately preserved for future generations of the appropriate families to rediscover. Even more specifically, Elena had described the process by which sites were concealed, with entrances disguised and protective rituals performed to ensure that sacred objects would remain intact until cultural conditions allowed for their proper restoration. According to Elena, Dr. Hernandez continued, certain families were designated as keepers of specific ceremonial locations, with responsibility passed down through generations, even when the families were forced to live elsewhere. The knowledge was preserved through dreams, stories, and spiritual connections that would eventually guide the right people back to their ancestral responsibilities. The description sent chills through Maria, connecting directly to her recent experiences with vivid dreams and inexplicable familiarity with the ceremonial complex. Dr. Hernandez noticed her reaction and leaned forward with increased interest. Have you been experiencing anything that might be consistent with these traditional forms of cultural guidance? Dreams, intuitive knowledge about the sites, sense of spiritual connection to specific locations? Maria shared her experiences cautiously, uncertain how an academic would respond to claims about inherited spiritual knowledge and prophetic dreams. To her surprise, Dr. Hernandez listened with respect and recognition rather than skepticism. These phenomena are well documented in indigenous communities throughout the Southwest, she explained. Ancestral knowledge often manifests through exactly the types of experiences you're describing, particularly when people with appropriate family connections encounter significant cultural sites. The conversation took a more serious turn when Dr. Hernandez explained the contemporary implications of Maria's discoveries. If you've found one of the ceremonial complexes that Elena Montoya described, you're dealing with something of extraordinary cultural and archaeological significance. But you're also potentially walking into a complex web of federal regulations, tribal sovereignty issues, and competing claims about cultural ownership and stewardship responsibilities. Dr. Hernandez outlined the various federal laws that could apply to Maria's situation, including the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, which made it illegal to excavate or disturb archaeological sites on both public and private land without proper permits. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act could also be relevant if the site contained any human remains or objects with specific cultural significance to federally recognized tribes. Even more concerning, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act gave tribal communities certain rights regarding access to sacred sites, regardless of current property ownership. The good news, Dr. Hernandez continued, is that if you can establish legitimate family connections to the site's original inhabitants, you may have stronger standing to participate in decisions about how the discovery is handled. The bad news is that proving such connections often requires extensive documentation and recognition from contemporary tribal authorities, which can be a lengthy and politically complicated process. The meeting concluded with Dr. Hernandez offering to help Maria research her family connections more thoroughly while providing guidance about appropriate protocols for handling the archaeological site. She also suggested that Maria should consider contacting the Tohono O'odham Nation's Cultural Resources Department to discuss her discoveries and potential family connections before the site became known to federal agencies through other channels. That weekend, Maria made the difficult decision to share her discoveries with Eduardo, whose construction experience and practical wisdom had guided her through the ranch purchase and renovation process. She needed someone she trusted completely to help her navigate the increasingly complex situation, and Eduardo's familiarity with both construction techniques and local cultural sensitivities made him an ideal confidant. When desperate single mother Maria Delgado purchased a foreclosed 320-acre cattle ranch in remote Arizona for $47,000, using her entire life savings and a risky loan against her truck to escape rising rent prices and provide stability for her twin boys, she never imagined that clearing brush from an eroded hillside would reveal ancient stone structures partially buried beneath decades of accumulated soil. Attract teams of archaeologists from 3 major universities, connect her property to a sacred ceremonial site used by the Tohono O'odham Nation for over 8 centuries. Draw the attention of federal agencies claiming jurisdiction under the Archaeological Resources Protection Act. Link her to a network of indigenous activists fighting to reclaim stolen cultural heritage. uncover her own surprising ancestral connections to the very people whose sacred ground she now owned, and transform her from an overworked restaurant manager, struggling to make ends meet, into the reluctant guardian of what tribal elders are calling one of the most significant, undisturbed Native American ceremonial complexes discovered in the Southwest in the past 50 years. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary journey that completely changed Maria's understanding of her own identity and purpose, let me know in the comments which state you're watching from. And if you're fascinated by stories of hidden history and cultural discovery, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because next week I'll be revealing the shocking contents of the underground ceremonial chamber that federal agents tried to seal off, and the ancient artifacts that could rewrite our understanding of pre-Columbian civilization in North America. The weathered foreclosure sale sign had been standing crooked in the desert wind for nearly 18 months before Maria Delgado first noticed it during her desperate weekend drives through rural Pima County, searching for any affordable housing option that might allow her to escape the relentless cycle of rising rents in Tucson. 3 years of working double shifts as a restaurant manager while raising her 8-year-old twin sons, Diego and Mateo, alone had left her exhausted, financially stretched, and increasingly desperate as every apartment complex in the city seemed determined to price out working families like hers. The divorce 2 years earlier had been necessary but financially devastating. Her ex-husband, Carlos, had disappeared completely after the papers were signed, leaving her with no child support and mounting debts from his gambling addiction that she'd only discovered after it was too late. The small 2-bedroom apartment that had felt like a fresh start now felt like a trap, with the landlord announcing yet another rent increase that would consume nearly 70% of her income, making it impossible to save anything for emergencies or the boys' future. Maria had grown up hearing her grandmother's stories about their family's connection to the desert, how their ancestors had lived in harmony with this harsh but beautiful landscape long before borders existed, before reservations were created, before the federal government decided who belonged where. But those stories had always seemed like distant fairy tales, disconnected from the reality of urban life, work schedules, and the constant struggle to pay bills on time. Now driving through the endless expanse of saguaro cacti and creosote bushes, she found herself wondering if those old stories might hold some practical wisdom about surviving in a place where the cost of living seemed designed to push ordinary families out. The ranch property sat 15 miles outside of Tucson, accessible only by a winding dirt road that disappeared into arroyos and emerged again on higher ground, where the Sonoran Desert stretched endlessly toward mountains that changed color with the shifting light. The main house, a 1960s adobe structure with a red tile roof, had clearly been abandoned for years. Windows were broken, the front porch sagged dangerously, and desert plants had begun reclaiming the yard, sending thorny branches through gaps in the walls. But the basic structure appeared sound, and the property included water rights, a well that supposedly still functioned, and enough space for the boys to run free instead of being confined to a cramped apartment where neighbors complained about every footstep. More importantly, the asking price of $85,000 had been reduced twice, first to $65,000, then to $52,000, as buyers apparently decided that the remote location and extensive renovation needs outweighed any potential benefits. Maria had exactly $47,000 available if she cashed out her modest retirement account, took a loan against her pickup truck, and borrowed the remaining amount from her brother Eduardo, who had offered to help despite his own financial struggles. As a construction worker supporting 4 children, the real estate agent, a tired-looking woman named Janet, who seemed surprised that anyone was interested in viewing the property, met Maria on a blazing Saturday afternoon in early October. The drive out to the ranch took 45 minutes, winding through desert landscape that grew more remote and beautiful with each mile. Most people take one look at the condition of the house and the distance from town and decide it's not worth the hassle, Janet explained as they pulled up to the property. The previous owners were cattle ranchers who lost everything in the 2008 financial crisis. The bank's been trying to unload this place ever since, but it's just too far from civilization for most buyers. Up close, the house was simultaneously more damaged and more promising than it had appeared in the online photos. The adobe walls were thick and solid, built to withstand desert heat and winter cold. But the roof needed extensive repairs, the plumbing had to be completely replaced, and the electrical system dated back decades. The kitchen appliances were beyond salvage, and most of the interior walls needed new drywall and paint. Yet something about the property spoke to Maria in a way she couldn't quite articulate, a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with practical considerations or financial calculations. The land itself was breathtaking, rolling hills covered with desert vegetation, ancient saguaro cacti standing like sentinels against the vast sky, and views that stretched for miles in every direction. Property includes 320 acres, Janet noted, consulting her folder of documents. Original ranch operation ran cattle here for 30 years before the financial problems started. There's good water from the well, and the land could support livestock, again with some investment in fencing and infrastructure. As they walked around the property, Maria found herself imagining Diego and Mateo exploring the arroyos, learning to identify desert plants and animals, growing up with the kind of freedom and connection to the natural world that her grandmother had described from her own childhood. The boys had never lived anywhere but apartments and suburban neighborhoods, never experienced the profound silence of the desert at night, or the spectacular sunrises that painted the mountains in shades of gold and red that couldn't be captured in photographs. "What's the absolute lowest price the bank would accept?" Maria asked as they concluded the tour, though she already knew the answer would probably be beyond her reach. Janet studied her with shrewd eyes, perhaps recognizing the desperation that Maria tried to keep hidden. "Well, they've been carrying this property for 6 years now, paying taxes and maintenance costs with no return. Between you and me, I think they'd seriously consider any reasonable cash offer, especially from someone who actually plans to live here and fix it up rather than just flip it for profit." That evening, after picking up the boys from their weekend, stay with her sister Carmen, Maria sat at her kitchen table with financial documents spread across every available surface, trying to calculate whether the impossible might actually be possible. The numbers were daunting, but not insurmountable if she was willing to take significant risks and commit to doing most of the renovation work herself with help from Eduardo and his construction crew friends, who often worked weekend side jobs for extra income. The boys listened with growing excitement as she explained the possibility of moving to a ranch where they could have their own horses, explore caves and canyons, and attend a small rural school where teachers knew every student personally instead of being lost in overcrowded urban classrooms. "Would we have to leave all our friends?" Mateo asked, the more cautious of the twins, while Diego immediately began planning adventures involving treasure hunts and camping under the stars. "We'd make new friends," Maria assured them, though she privately worried about the social isolation and the 45-minute drive to town for groceries, medical appointments, and emergencies. "And your cousins could visit us for vacations and holidays. You'd have more space to play and learn about nature, like the stories great-grandma used to tell about how our family lived in the desert long ago." Eduardo's reaction to the underground ceremonial complex was immediate and profound. As someone who had grown up in the region and maintained connections to various Native American communities through his construction work on reservation projects, he recognized the significance of Maria's discovery even more clearly than she did. "Maria, this is huge," he said after examining the chambers and artifacts. "This isn't just archaeologically important. This is spiritually significant to people who are still alive today, people who have been waiting generations for these sites to be found by the right families." His cultural knowledge provided context that Maria had been lacking. Eduardo explained that many southwestern tribes had maintained oral traditions about sacred sites that were concealed during periods of cultural suppression but never forgotten completely. Families with hereditary responsibilities for specific ceremonial locations often preserved knowledge through exactly the kinds of dreams and spiritual experiences that Maria had been having. "The question isn't whether you should contact tribal authorities," Eduardo said firmly. "The question is how to do it respectfully and in ways that honor both your family's potential connections and the contemporary tribal communities who have maintained these traditions. You can't handle this alone, and you shouldn't try to." Eduardo's advice proved prescient when Maria discovered evidence that her activities at the site had not gone unnoticed. While conducting routine excavation work the following Saturday, she found fresh footprints in the soft soil around the ceremonial complex's entrance, prints that belonged to someone who had visited the site recently while she and the boys were in town. More concerning were subtle signs that someone had entered the underground chambers, with a few artifacts slightly displaced from their original positions and soil disturbance patterns that suggested careful but unauthorized exploration. The realization that unknown individuals were aware of her discovery and had been conducting their own investigation of the site created new urgency around the question of how to proceed. If the site's existence was becoming known to other parties, Maria's window for establishing her family's cultural claims and determining appropriate stewardship arrangements was rapidly closing. That evening, after securing the boys with Carmen for an overnight stay, Maria called the Tohono O'odham Nation's Cultural Resources Department, following Dr. Hernandez's recommendation about contacting tribal authorities directly rather than going through federal agencies. The conversation with James Antone, the tribe's cultural preservation director, was both encouraging and sobering. Antone listened to Maria's account with interest and respect, asking detailed questions about the site's features, the artifacts she had discovered, and her family's potential connections to the area. His responses indicated familiarity with the general location and awareness of oral traditions that referenced ceremonial sites in that region, though he was careful not to confirm or deny specific tribal claims until appropriate cultural protocols had been followed. "What you're describing sounds consistent with sacred sites that our elders have talked about for many years," Antone explained. "If your family connections are legitimate, and if the site is what it appears to be, then we're dealing with something that goes beyond archaeology into active spiritual and cultural significance for our community." Antone proposed a careful approach that would honor both Maria's property rights and tribal cultural interests. A small team of tribal elders and cultural experts would visit the site to assess its significance and determine appropriate protocols for its preservation and potential use. If Maria's family connections were confirmed through traditional verification methods, she could potentially be recognized as a legitimate cultural steward with ongoing responsibilities for the site's care and protection. The proposal offered hope for a collaborative solution that could preserve the site's cultural integrity while respecting Maria's property ownership. However, Antone also warned that the process would inevitably attract attention from federal agencies, universities, and potentially other tribal communities who might have competing claims or interests in the ceremonial complex. "Once this becomes official, you won't be able to control who gets involved or how the situation develops," Antone cautioned. "Federal archaeologists, Bureau of Indian Affairs officials, and academic researchers will all want access to the site. Your life is going to become very complicated very quickly. The warning proved prophetic when Maria discovered the next morning that someone had left a business card wedged into her front door during the night. The card belonged to Dr. Michael Stevens, an archaeologist from Arizona State University, who specialized in prehistoric southwestern cultures. A handwritten note on the back stated simply, "We should talk about your recent discoveries. This situation requires professional guidance to avoid serious legal complications." The message made it clear that knowledge of the ceremonial site was spreading beyond the carefully controlled circle of people Maria had chosen to involve. Someone, possibly the unknown individual who had been visiting the site without permission, had contacted academic or government authorities about her discoveries. The collaborative approach she had hoped to pursue with tribal representatives was about to be complicated by outside interests that might have very different priorities regarding the site's future. As Maria sat at her kitchen table that morning, holding Dr. Stevens' business card and contemplating the phone call she would have to make, she realized that her quiet life as a single mother managing a remote ranch renovation had officially ended. The ceremonial complex beneath her property had connected her to cultural currents and institutional interests that would transform not only her relationship to the land, but her entire understanding of her family's place in the complex history of the American Southwest. Maria stared at Dr. Stevens' business card for nearly an hour before finally dialing the number, rehearsing various approaches to a conversation that could determine the future of her property and her family's security. When Stevens answered on the second ring, his voice carried the confident authority of someone accustomed to dealing with significant archaeological discoveries and the complex legal frameworks that surrounded them. "Ms. Delgado, thank you for calling," Stevens began without preamble. "I understand you've uncovered what appears to be a substantial Native American ceremonial site on your property. These situations require careful handling to ensure proper preservation protocols and compliance with federal regulations." The immediate assumption of authority in Stevens' tone triggered defensive instincts that surprised Maria with their intensity. "Dr. Stevens, I haven't contacted any universities about discoveries on my property. How did you learn about this situation?" The question hung in the air for several seconds before Stevens responded with careful diplomatic language that confirmed Maria's suspicions about unauthorized surveillance of her activities. The archaeological community in Arizona is relatively small, and discoveries of this magnitude tend to generate discussion among professionals who monitor such developments. What's important now is ensuring that proper protocols are followed to protect both the cultural significance of the site and your interests as the property owner. Stevens proposed an immediate site visit with a team of specialists who could conduct preliminary assessments and provide guidance about appropriate next steps. His emphasis on urgency and professional expertise contained subtle but unmistakable implications that amateur handling of the situation could result in legal complications or damage to irreplaceable cultural resources. However, Maria's recent conversations with Dr. Hernandez and James Antone had provided her with enough knowledge to recognize that Stevens's approach prioritized academic and institutional interests over tribal cultural concerns or property owner rights. "Dr. Stevens, I appreciate your offer of assistance, but I'm already working with the Tohono O'odham Nation's Cultural Resources Department to ensure appropriate protocols are followed. Any academic involvement would need to be coordinated through their Cultural Preservation Office." The response clearly surprised Stevens, whose tone shifted from confident authority to cautious negotiation. Of course, tribal consultation is essential for any significant archaeological discovery. However, the academic community has expertise, and resources that can complement tribal knowledge while ensuring proper documentation according to current professional standards. Maria recognized the diplomatic language as a polite way of asserting that university archaeologists possessed superior technical capabilities compared to tribal cultural experts, an assumption that reflected exactly the kind of institutional bias that Dr. Hernandez had warned her about. "I understand your perspective, Dr. Stevens, but my priority is following culturally appropriate protocols rather than academic preferences. If the tribal cultural experts decide that university involvement would be beneficial, I'm sure they'll make that determination." After ending the call, Maria immediately contacted James Antone to report the contact from Arizona State University and to accelerate their planned site assessment. Antone's reaction confirmed her suspicions that Stevens' involvement represented potential complications rather than helpful assistance. Academic archaeologists often have different priorities than tribal communities, Antone explained diplomatically. Their focus on research and publication doesn't always align with our concerns about cultural preservation and spiritual protection of sacred sites. We'll need to move quickly to establish proper tribal oversight before outside institutions assert claims or jurisdiction. Antone arranged for a site visit the following weekend, bringing a carefully selected team that included tribal elders with knowledge of traditional ceremonial practices, cultural historians familiar with the oral traditions about concealed sacred sites, and contemporary tribal officials with experience in managing complex interactions with federal agencies and academic institutions. The intervening days passed with increasing tension as Maria tried to maintain normal routines while preparing for what she understood would be a pivotal moment in determining how her discovery would be handled. Her restaurant work became increasingly difficult to focus on as she found herself constantly wondering about developments at the ranch and worrying about the legal and cultural implications of decisions being made beyond her control. The boys sensed their mother's stress, despite her efforts to shield them from the complexities of the situation. Diego, with his developing interest in desert ecology, had begun asking sophisticated questions about the historical significance of their property and whether their discoveries meant they were living on land that belonged to other people. Mateo, more artistically inclined, had started having dreams similar to Maria's, featuring the elderly woman who seemed to provide guidance about the ceremonial site's significance and proper care. "Mom, the lady in my dream says we're supposed to take care of the special place under the hill," Mateo reported one morning over breakfast. "She says our family has been waiting a long time to come home, and now we have to make sure everything is done the right way." The comment sent chills through Maria, confirming that whatever spiritual or cultural forces were active around the ceremonial site were affecting her entire family. The dreams were no longer individual experiences, but shared family phenomena that seemed to be providing guidance about their responsibilities as potential cultural stewards. Saturday morning arrived clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant desert sunshine that made the landscape seem simultaneously ancient and eternal. James Antone arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, accompanied by 3 tribal elders, whose presence immediately transformed the atmosphere around the ceremonial site from archaeological curiosity to active spiritual significance. Elena Yazzie, the senior elder in the group, was a woman in her 70s, whose grandmother had been one of the traditional keepers of knowledge about concealed sacred sites. Her reaction to the underground chambers was immediate and profound, moving through the spaces with obvious familiarity, despite never having visited the specific location before. "This is one of the places our grandmothers told us about," she confirmed after completing a careful examination of the ceremonial chambers. The arrangements of the objects, the astronomical alignments, the spiritual protections that were placed here, everything matches the traditional descriptions that have been preserved in our families. Thomas Miguel, a cultural historian and medicine man, conducted his own assessment of the site's features, paying particular attention to the petroglyphs and ceremonial objects that Maria had discovered. His analysis provided cultural context that transformed her understanding of what she had found, from historical artifacts to continuing spiritual significance. These chambers were used for ceremonies that connected our people to the movement of stars and seasons, Miguel explained. The astronomical devices you found were tools for maintaining the spiritual calendar that governed agricultural cycles, hunting patterns, and religious observances. This wasn't just a ceremonial site. It was a center for maintaining the knowledge that kept our communities in harmony with the natural world. The third elder, Robert Antone, James's uncle and a specialist in traditional genealogical knowledge, interviewed Maria extensively about her family history and the dreams that had guided her to the site. His questions were detailed and respectful, focusing on specific elements of her experiences that would confirm or contradict her potential hereditary connections to the site's original stewards. The dreams you describe, particularly the guidance from the elderly woman who looks like your great-grandmother, are consistent with traditional methods of transmitting cultural knowledge across generations, Robert explained. When families are forced to live away from their ancestral territories, spiritual connections often remain active until conditions allow for proper reunion with cultural responsibilities. The elders spent nearly 4 hours at the site, conducting ceremonies to acknowledge their presence in the sacred spaces, documenting the condition and arrangement of ceremonial objects, and assessing the overall cultural significance of Maria's discoveries. Their conclusion was unanimous and transformative for Maria's understanding of her situation. This is definitely one of the major ceremonial centers that our oral traditions describe, Elena announced at the conclusion of their assessment. The site was sealed and protected during the period when our people were forced onto reservations, with specific families designated to maintain knowledge about its location and eventual restoration. Based on your family connections and the spiritual guidance you've received, we believe you may be descended from one of those keeper families. The recognition carried both honor and responsibility that Maria was only beginning to understand. As a potential hereditary steward of the ceremonial site, she would have cultural obligations that extended far beyond simple property ownership. The artifacts and sacred spaces would require ongoing protection, appropriate ceremonial use, and careful management of access by tribal members who needed to conduct traditional religious practices. James Antone outlined the practical implications of the elders' assessment. If we proceed with formal recognition of your cultural stewardship, the site will need to be properly registered with tribal cultural authorities and coordinated with federal agencies according to established protocols. This will provide legal protection for the site's cultural integrity while preserving your property rights within appropriate frameworks. However, the formal recognition process would inevitably attract attention from the same academic and government institutions that Maria had been trying to avoid. Dr. Stevens from Arizona State University had already demonstrated awareness of the site's existence, and federal archaeologists would certainly become involved once tribal authorities began coordinating with Bureau of Indian Affairs officials about cultural resource management. We can try to control the process and ensure that tribal interests remain primary, James assured her. But once this becomes official, you'll be dealing with multiple federal agencies, university research programs, and potentially competing claims from other tribal communities who might have historical connections to the site. The warning proved prophetic when Maria returned home that evening to find 2 vehicles parked in her driveway. Dr. Stevens's university sedan and a government SUV with Bureau of Indian Affairs plates. The occupants were waiting patiently on her front porch, clearly prepared for an extended conversation about her recent discoveries and their implications for federal archaeological oversight. Dr. Stevens introduced his companion as Sarah Chen, a federal archaeologist with the Bureau of Indian Affairs who specialized in managing discoveries on private land that had cultural significance to Native American communities. Chen's presence indicated that the situation had already escalated beyond local academic interest to federal jurisdiction, with all the legal complexities and institutional procedures that such involvement would entail. Ms. Delgado, we understand that tribal representatives have conducted an initial assessment of archaeological features on your property, Chen began diplomatically. Federal regulations require coordination between tribal authorities and government agencies whenever significant cultural resources are discovered, regardless of property ownership status. The conversation that followed was a careful dance of competing authorities and jurisdictional claims, with each party trying to establish their legitimate interests in the ceremonial site while avoiding direct conflicts that could complicate future cooperation. Stevens emphasized the importance of proper academic documentation and research protocols, while Chen focused on federal compliance requirements and interagency coordination procedures. Maria found herself in the unexpected position of mediating between institutional interests while trying to protect both her property rights and her newly understood cultural responsibilities. The collaborative approach she had hoped to pursue with tribal authorities was becoming complicated by outside pressures that threatened to transform the site from a place of cultural renewal into a bureaucratic battleground. I appreciate everyone's interest in ensuring proper handling of this discovery, Maria said carefully, but my primary obligation is to the tribal elders who have confirmed my family's cultural connections to this site. Any academic or federal involvement will need to be coordinated through the Tohono O'odham Nation's Cultural Preservation Office according to their established protocols. The response clearly frustrated both Stevens and Chen, who were accustomed to directing archaeological investigations according to their institutional priorities, rather than deferring to tribal authority. However, recent changes in federal policy regarding Native American cultural resources had strengthened tribal rights to control access to sacred sites, even when located on private property. After the officials departed with promises to coordinate their involvement through appropriate tribal channels, Maria realized that her quiet life on the ranch had permanently ended. The ceremonial site had connected her to cultural currents and institutional interests that would transform every aspect of her family's relationship to their new home. That night, as she tucked the boys into bed and listened to their excited questions about the day's visitors and the ongoing discoveries on their property, Maria understood that she had become the guardian of something far more significant than a home or investment. The ceremonial complex beneath their ranch represented centuries of cultural preservation, spiritual significance, and contemporary struggles over cultural identity and institutional control that would shape their family's future in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. The following Monday brought an unexpected phone call that would further complicate Maria's already complex situation. Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian had learned about the ceremonial site through professional networks and was requesting permission to send a team of specialists to conduct what she described as culturally sensitive documentation that would ensure the proper preservation and interpretation of the discovery. Ms. Delgado, sites of this significance are extraordinarily rare. Dr. Martinez explained with the practiced enthusiasm of someone accustomed to securing access to important archaeological discoveries. The Smithsonian has developed protocols specifically designed to honor tribal cultural concerns while ensuring that invaluable heritage resources receive appropriate scholarly attention and public education opportunities. Maria's wariness had been heightened by her previous interactions with Dr. Stevens and the federal archaeologist, making her suspicious of any outside institution's claims about cultural sensitivity and tribal cooperation. Dr. Martinez, I'm working exclusively with the Tohono O'odham Nation's Cultural Preservation Office to determine appropriate protocols for this site. Any outside involvement would need to be requested and approved by their tribal authorities. The response seemed to surprise Martinez, who had apparently expected the same receptive cooperation that academic institutions typically received when approaching private property owners about archaeological discoveries. Of course, tribal consultation is essential, but the Smithsonian has unique resources and expertise that could greatly benefit both the tribal community and the broader understanding of Southwestern cultural history. After ending the call, Maria immediately contacted James Antone to report this latest institutional interest in the ceremonial site. His reaction confirmed her suspicions that the Smithsonian's involvement would introduce additional complications rather than helpful assistance. Major museums often have different priorities than tribal communities regarding cultural artifacts and sacred sites, Antone explained diplomatically. Their focus on research, exhibition, and public education doesn't always align with our concerns about maintaining the spiritual integrity and cultural protection that these sites require. More concerning was Antone's revelation that federal agencies had begun conducting their own inquiries about the site's significance and potential jurisdiction issues. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was coordinating with the Bureau of Land Management to determine whether any federal oversight authorities applied to Maria's property, while the National Park Service was assessing whether the discovery warranted consideration for federal historical designation. Once federal agencies become involved, the situation tends to develop momentum beyond anyone's control, Antone warned. We need to establish clear tribal authority over cultural aspects of the site before other institutions assert competing claims or jurisdiction. The urgency became even more apparent when Maria discovered that her property had attracted unauthorized visitors during her absence at work. Fresh tire tracks in areas where no legitimate business would require vehicle access, disturbed vegetation around the ceremonial site's concealed entrance, and subtle signs that someone had attempted to photograph or document the underground. Chambers without permission indicated that knowledge of the discovery was spreading beyond the controlled circle of people she had chosen to involve. Most troubling were indications that the unauthorized visitors possessed sophisticated equipment and professional knowledge about archaeological investigation techniques. Tool marks around the entrance suggested attempts to expand access to the underground chambers, while displaced artifacts indicated systematic documentation efforts that went far beyond casual curiosity or treasure hunting. Eduardo, whose construction experience had taught him to recognize different types of equipment marks and disturbance patterns, confirmed Maria's worst suspicions after examining the evidence. This wasn't random trespassing or amateur artifact hunting, he concluded grimly. Someone with professional archaeological training and proper excavation tools has been conducting unauthorized research at your site. The realization that unknown professionals were conducting clandestine investigations of the ceremonial complex created new urgency around establishing proper legal and cultural protection for the site. If academic researchers or government officials were proceeding without tribal consultation or property owner permission, Maria's ability to control how the discovery was handled was rapidly disappearing. James Antone's response to this development was immediate and decisive. We need to accelerate the formal recognition process and establish visible tribal presence at the site before unauthorized activities compromise the cultural integrity or legal status of your discovery. Within 48 hours, tribal cultural experts had installed discreet security measures around the ceremonial site, including motion-activated cameras and traditional spiritual protections that would alert appropriate authorities to any unauthorized presence. More significantly, they began conducting regular ceremonial activities at the site, establishing contemporary tribal use that would strengthen legal claims for cultural access and spiritual stewardship. The presence of tribal members conducting traditional ceremonies on Maria's property created a profound shift in the atmosphere and significance of her ranch. What had been a private family discovery was becoming an active center for cultural renewal and spiritual practice that connected her property to broader tribal community life in ways she had never anticipated. Elena Yazzie, the senior elder who had confirmed the site's significance, began visiting regularly to conduct sunrise prayers and seasonal ceremonies that honored the spiritual significance of the underground chambers. Her presence brought other tribal members who had hereditary connections to the ceremonial traditions associated with such sites, gradually creating a community of practice that transformed Maria's understanding of her role from property owner to cultural steward. The ceremonies we conduct here aren't just historical reenactments, Elena explained during one of her extended visits. These are continuing religious practices that connect our contemporary community to spiritual traditions that have been maintained for centuries, even when the physical sites were hidden or inaccessible. The ongoing ceremonial use of the site created both profound meaning and practical complications for Maria's family life. The boys were fascinated by the traditional activities and eager to learn about their potential cultural heritage, but the constant presence of tribal members conducting religious ceremonies made their property feel less like a private home and more like a public cultural center. More challenging were the interactions with federal and academic officials who continued pressing for access to the site despite Maria's insistence that all such requests be coordinated through tribal authorities. Dr. Stevens from Arizona State University had submitted formal documentation requesting research permits, while federal archaeologists had begun asserting jurisdiction claims based on the site's potential significance for understanding regional cultural history. The problem with these institutional approaches, James Antone explained during a strategy meeting at the Tribal Cultural Center, is that they treat sacred sites as research resources rather than continuing places of spiritual significance. For living communities, once they establish access rights, the cultural and religious aspects become secondary to academic and bureaucratic priorities. The tension between institutional interests and tribal cultural concerns came to a head when Maria received certified letters from 3 different federal agencies, each claiming some form of jurisdiction over the ceremonial site and demanding access for official assessments. The Archaeological Resources Protection Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, and various provisions of federal Indian law created overlapping regulatory frameworks that could potentially supersede both property rights and tribal cultural authority. Catherine Chen, the federal archaeologist who had initially contacted Maria, followed up the official letters with a phone call that made the government's position unmistakably clear. Ms. Delgado, federal law requires proper documentation and assessment of significant archaeological discoveries, regardless of property ownership or tribal consultation preferences. Continued restriction of access could result in legal complications that would be far more disruptive than cooperative compliance with established protocols. The threat was diplomatically phrased, but unmistakably coercive, indicating that federal agencies were prepared to use legal authority to override Maria's attempts to manage the situation through tribal cultural channels. The collaborative approach she had hoped to pursue was being undermined by institutional pressures that treated the ceremonial site as a bureaucratic jurisdiction issue rather than a cultural and spiritual matter requiring respectful consultation. Maria's response was carefully considered but firm. "Ms. Chen, I understand federal interests in archaeological resources, but this site has active spiritual significance for tribal communities who have legal standing under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. Any federal involvement will need to accommodate ongoing religious use and tribal cultural authority over sacred aspects of the discovery." The conversation ended with polite but obvious disagreement about how to proceed, setting up potential conflicts between federal regulatory authority and tribal religious rights that could ultimately require resolution through federal courts or congressional intervention. Meanwhile, the unauthorized professional investigation of the site had continued despite increased security measures, with evidence suggesting that multiple research teams were conducting clandestine documentation efforts during nighttime hours when detection would be less likely. Trail cameras had captured images of individuals using sophisticated archaeological equipment to map the underground chambers and catalog artifacts without any official permission or tribal consultation. Most disturbing was the discovery that some ceremonial objects had been moved from their original positions, suggesting that unauthorized researchers were not merely documenting the site, but actively disturbing cultural materials that tribal elders considered sacred and spiritually protected. The violation of these traditional protections was viewed by tribal community members as not just illegal trespassing, but active desecration of religious sites. "What these people don't understand," Elena Yazzie said, with unusual anger during an emergency meeting called to address the unauthorized disturbances, is that moving sacred objects or conducting research in ceremonial spaces without proper spiritual preparation can have serious consequences for everyone involved. These sites aren't just historical artifacts, they're spiritually active places that require respectful protocols to maintain their power and protection. The tribal response was swift and comprehensive. Traditional spiritual practitioners conducted cleansing ceremonies to restore appropriate spiritual conditions at the disturbed areas, while tribal law enforcement coordinated with county sheriffs, deputies, to increase patrols and investigate the unauthorized activities. More significantly, tribal attorneys began preparing legal challenges to federal jurisdiction claims that failed to adequately recognize tribal religious rights and cultural authority. The escalating conflicts attracted media attention that Maria had desperately hoped to avoid. A reporter from the Arizona Republic had learned about the discovery through sources at the university, and her article about the hidden ceremonial complex discovered by a struggling single mother brought additional, unwanted attention from treasure hunters, New Age spiritual seekers, and amateur archaeologists who began showing up uninvited at Maria's property. The media coverage also attracted attention from other tribal communities who claimed historical connections to the ceremonial site, creating potential competing claims that could complicate the Tohono O'odham Nation's efforts to establish cultural authority over the discovery. Representatives from the Akimal O'odham and Pasqua Yaqui tribes requested consultations about their potential interests in the site, while academic researchers began arguing that multiple tribal claims demonstrated the need for neutral federal oversight rather than single tribe cultural control. As Maria stood on her front porch one evening, watching unauthorized visitors being turned away by tribal security personnel, while federal officials parked at the property boundaries to conduct surveillance of activities they couldn't legally access, She realized that her simple desire for affordable housing had connected her family to cultural and political currents that extended far beyond her personal circumstances. The ceremonial site beneath her ranch had become a focal point for contemporary struggles over cultural identity, institutional authority, and the complex relationships between Native American communities and the federal agencies, academic institutions, and legal frameworks that continued to assert control over indigenous heritage and spiritual practices. The quiet desert evening, once a source of peace and renewal after difficult days at the restaurant, now felt charged with tensions and possibilities that would reshape not only her family's future, but potentially the broader understanding of how sacred sites, cultural heritage, and property rights intersected in the contemporary American Southwest. The situation reached a critical turning point when Maria arrived home from work on a Wednesday evening to find her property surrounded by vehicles from multiple agencies and institutions, all apparently coordinating some kind of joint operation without her knowledge or consent. Federal archaeologists, university researchers, tribal representatives, and county law enforcement officers were engaged in heated discussions near the ceremonial site, while additional personnel were setting up what appeared to be a command post in her front yard. James Antone approached her immediately as she parked her truck, his expression grim with frustration and concern. "Maria, we have a serious problem. Federal agencies obtained emergency access permits this afternoon, claiming that unauthorized disturbances at the site created imminent threats to irreplaceable cultural resources. They're asserting jurisdiction under emergency provisions that bypass normal consultation requirements." The bureaucratic maneuvering represented exactly the kind of institutional overreach that Maria had feared from the beginning. Federal agencies had used the unauthorized research activities conducted by unknown parties as justification for asserting control over the ceremonial site, effectively punishing her for violations committed by trespassers whom she had been trying to prevent from accessing the discovery. Dr. Catherine Chen, the federal archaeologist who had previously threatened legal action, was directing the establishment of what she described as a protective perimeter around the underground chambers. Her team was installing barriers, documentation equipment, and security measures that would effectively end Maria's ability to control access to her own property. "Ms. Delgado, I understand your concerns about this development," Chen said with diplomatic sympathy that barely concealed bureaucratic satisfaction. However, the evidence of ongoing, unauthorized disturbances required immediate action to prevent further damage to nationally significant cultural resources. Once proper protective measures are established, we can discuss appropriate protocols for coordinated access and management. The language was carefully crafted to present federal intervention as protective rather than confiscatory, but the practical effect was to transform Maria's private property into a government-controlled archaeological site, with herself relegated to the role of peripheral stakeholder rather than primary decision-maker. Elena Yazzie, who had been conducting regular ceremonies at the site, was visibly distressed by the federal takeover and its implications for ongoing tribal spiritual practices. "They're treating this as a dead historical site instead of a living sacred place," she explained to Maria with controlled anger. "Federal archaeologists don't understand that their documentation methods and security procedures interfere with the spiritual activities that keep these sites alive and connected to our communities." The tribal elders' concerns were dismissed by federal officials as secondary to immediate preservation needs, reflecting exactly the kind of institutional bias that prioritized academic research and bureaucratic control over indigenous religious practices and cultural authority. Dr. Stevens from Arizona State University, who had been granted access as part of the emergency response team, was enthusiastically directing graduate students in preliminary documentation efforts that treated the ceremonial objects as research specimens rather than sacred items requiring respectful protocols. Maria found herself caught between competing authorities, each claiming to represent her best interests while pursuing institutional agendas that had little to do with her family's needs or her emerging understanding of cultural stewardship responsibilities. Federal officials presented their intervention as necessary protection of her discovery, while tribal representatives emphasized the importance of maintaining cultural control over sacred sites, regardless of property ownership complications. The legal complexity became even more challenging when Maria received a visit from David Running Bear, an attorney specializing in Native American law who had been contacted by tribal authorities to assess options for challenging federal jurisdiction claims. His analysis of the situation revealed layers of competing legal frameworks that would make any resolution both time-consuming and expensive. The federal emergency intervention creates a complex precedent, Running Bear explained during their consultation at the Tribal Cultural Center, away from the federal personnel now occupying Maria's property. Once agencies assert jurisdiction under emergency provisions, they can maintain control indefinitely by citing ongoing preservation needs and research requirements. Your property rights become secondary to federal claims about cultural resource protection. However, Running Bear also identified potential legal strategies for challenging the federal takeover based on violations of tribal religious freedom, rights, and improper application of emergency provisions that were supposed to require genuine threats to cultural resources. If we can demonstrate that federal agencies used unauthorized trespassing by unknown parties as pretense for asserting control they couldn't obtain through normal consultation processes, we might be able to restore tribal authority and your property rights. The legal challenge would require extensive documentation of the timeline of events, proof that tribal cultural practices were being interfered with by federal management policies, and evidence that emergency provisions were being applied inappropriately to justify institutional preferences rather than genuine preservation needs. Meanwhile, the unauthorized research activities that had provided justification for federal intervention continued despite increased security measures, suggesting that the perpetrators had sophisticated knowledge of archaeological investigation techniques and possibly inside information about site access and security arrangements. Trail cameras captured images of individuals using professional equipment to conduct nighttime documentation efforts, but the quality of the surveillance footage made identification difficult. More disturbing was evidence that some of the unauthorized researchers possessed detailed knowledge about the site's layout and artifact locations that could only have been obtained through prior access or information provided by someone familiar with Maria's discoveries. Tool marks and disturbance patterns indicated systematic removal and replacement of specific ceremonial objects, suggesting research objectives that went beyond simple documentation to include detailed analysis or possibly sampling of sacred materials. Eduardo's investigation of the unauthorized activities revealed sophisticated planning and execution that suggested professional archaeological training rather than amateur treasure hunting or casual trespassing. These people know exactly what they're looking for and how to find it without leaving obvious traces, he reported after examining the latest evidence. They have inside information about the site's significance and probably connections to academic or government institutions that want access without going through official tribal consultation processes. The possibility that federal agencies or university researchers were themselves conducting unauthorized investigations while publicly claiming to protect the site from such activities added another layer of complexity to an already convoluted situation. If the very institutions asserting control over the ceremonial complex were responsible for the violations they claimed to be preventing, then the entire emergency intervention could be based on deliberately manufactured justifications. James Antone's investigation through tribal law enforcement networks revealed disturbing patterns of similar situations at other significant archaeological sites throughout the Southwest, where federal agencies had used various pretexts to assert control over discoveries on private land that had cultural significance to tribal communities. The pattern suggested systematic institutional strategies for bypassing tribal consultation requirements and property owner rights when major archaeological discoveries were involved. "This isn't just about your site," Antone explained during a confidential meeting with Maria and tribal attorneys. Federal agencies and academic institutions have been developing methods for asserting control over significant cultural discoveries, regardless of tribal rights or property ownership. Your situation is part of a broader pattern of institutional overreach that affects Native American communities throughout the region. The revelation transformed Maria's personal struggle into part of a larger political conflict over cultural sovereignty, institutional authority, and the rights of indigenous communities to control access to their sacred sites and cultural heritage. Her role had evolved from individual property owner to symbol of broader struggles over cultural identity and institutional power that extended far beyond her personal circumstances. The stakes became even higher when Dr. Martinez from the Smithsonian Institution arrived with a team of specialists who had been granted access through federal coordination rather than tribal consultation. Their presence represented the full institutional mobilization that Maria had feared from the beginning, with major museums and research institutions treating the ceremonial site as a unique opportunity for advancing academic careers and institutional prestige rather than respecting its continuing spiritual significance for tribal communities. The research potential of this site is extraordinary, Dr. Martinez explained to federal coordinators within Maria's hearing, apparently unconcerned about the property owner's presence during planning discussions. Artifacts of this sophistication and preservation quality could revolutionize understanding of pre-Columbian southwestern cultures and provide unprecedented insights into indigenous technological and spiritual achievements. The academic enthusiasm completely ignored tribal concerns about treating sacred objects as research specimens and ceremonial spaces as laboratory environments for advancing scholarly knowledge. Elena Yazzie and other tribal elders were relegated to peripheral consultation roles rather than primary authority over cultural aspects of the discovery, despite their hereditary knowledge and ongoing spiritual responsibilities for the site. Maria realized that her initial hope for collaborative management of the discovery had been systematically undermined by institutional interests that prioritized research access and bureaucratic control over cultural respect and property rights. The ceremonial site had become a battleground for competing authorities rather than a place of cultural renewal and spiritual significance. The personal cost of these developments was becoming overwhelming for Maria's family life and financial stability. The constant presence of federal personnel, academic researchers, and tribal representatives at her property made normal daily routines impossible, while the legal and cultural complexities of the situation consumed time and emotional energy that she needed for work and parenting responsibilities. More concerning were the effects on Diego and Mateo, who were struggling to understand why their home had become the center of adult conflicts over issues that seemed to have little to do with their family's immediate needs. The boys' excitement about their potential cultural heritage was being overshadowed by stress about the ongoing disputes and uncertainty about their future security on the property they had thought would provide stability. "Mom, are they going to make us move away from our house?" Mateo asked one evening after overhearing discussions about federal jurisdiction and legal challenges that could potentially affect their property ownership. The question highlighted the fundamental disconnect between Maria's original goal of providing housing security for her children and the complex cultural and institutional forces that now controlled their daily lives. Diego's question was even more pointed. If this place belongs to the tribal people, and we might be tribal people, too, why is everyone fighting about it instead of just figuring out how to share it properly? The 8-year-old's perspective cut through the layers of institutional complexity to identify the core issue that all the adults seem to be avoiding through their focus on jurisdictional disputes and bureaucratic procedures. The evening concluded with Maria sitting alone on her front porch, watching federal security personnel conduct perimeter patrols around ceremonial chambers that she had discovered through dreams and intuition but could no longer access without official permission. The stars that had once provided comfort and connection to the desert landscape now seemed to witness the transformation of her family's refuge into a contested institutional battleground where cultural significance, academic ambition, and bureaucratic authority competed for control over something that ultimately belonged to forces far larger than any of the human interests involved in the ongoing disputes. The breaking point came when Maria discovered federal. Researchers had entered the underground ceremonial chambers without tribal spiritual protocols, violating sacred spaces in ways that Elena Yazzie described as culturally catastrophic. The elderly tribal elder arrived at Maria's property early Thursday morning, visibly shaken after learning that Dr. Stevens and his graduate students had spent the previous night conducting detailed documentation of ceremonial objects and petroglyphs. Without performing the traditional cleansing rituals and spiritual preparations that tribal custom required before entering such sacred spaces. They moved sacred objects with their bare hands, photographed ceremonial symbols that aren't meant to be recorded, and disturbed spiritual arrangements that took our ancestors generations to establish properly, Elena explained with controlled fury that Maria had never seen from the typically gentle elder. Some violations can't be undone. The spiritual protections that kept this site safe for centuries have been compromised by people who don't understand what they're destroying. The cultural desecration represented everything that tribal representatives had warned about regarding institutional approaches to sacred sites. Federal and academic authorities treated the ceremonial complex as an archaeological resource rather than a living spiritual center, applying research methods that actively interfered with the cultural and religious significance that made the discovery valuable to contemporary tribal communities. Maria's response was swift and decisive. Despite the legal risks involved in challenging federal authority, she formally revoked permission for any further access to her property by non-tribal personnel, citing violations of agreements that had never actually been negotiated with her consent. Her decision was supported by David Running Bear, the tribal attorney, who argued that federal emergency provisions had been improperly applied to justify institutional access rather than genuine preservation needs. The federal intervention was supposedly necessary to protect cultural resources from unauthorized disturbance, Running Bear pointed out during an emergency legal consultation. But the agencies asserting control are themselves conducting unauthorized disturbances that violate both tribal religious practices and proper archaeological protocols. Their own actions undermine the justification for their jurisdiction claims, The legal challenge triggered immediate escalation from federal authorities, who threatened criminal charges under the Archaeological Resources Protection Act for interfering with authorized research activities on culturally significant sites. Dr. Chen's response was swift and intimidating, arriving at Maria's property with additional federal personnel and official documentation asserting expanded jurisdiction over the entire ranch rather than just the ceremonial area. Ms. Delgado, your property appears to contain a network of related cultural sites that require comprehensive federal oversight, Chen announced with bureaucratic authority that barely concealed institutional frustration with tribal resistance to their research agenda. Preliminary surveys indicate additional archaeological features throughout your land that fall under federal protection regardless of property ownership or tribal consultation preferences. The expansion of federal claims represented a dramatic escalation that threatened to transform Maria's entire ranch into a government-controlled archaeological preserve, effectively ending her property rights and her family's ability to maintain their home on the land they had purchased for financial security. The threat was clearly designed to pressure her into accepting limited federal control over the ceremonial site by demonstrating that continued resistance could result in total loss of property autonomy. However, the federal overreach also provided stronger grounds for legal challenges based on violations of due process rights and improper application of archaeological protection laws that were supposed to balance cultural preservation with property owner interests. Running Bear immediately filed emergency injunctions challenging the expanded jurisdiction claims while requesting federal court review of the emergency provisions that had been used to bypass normal consultation requirements. Meanwhile, tribal authorities accelerated their own protective measures, establishing continuous spiritual presence at the ceremonial site through rotating ceremonies conducted by traditional practitioners who maintained the cultural protocols that federal researchers had violated. Elena Yazi and other elders began conducting daily sunrise and sunset prayers that reasserted tribal religious authority over sacred spaces, regardless of bureaucratic jurisdiction claims. The ongoing ceremonial activities created practical complications for federal research operations, since tribal religious practices had legal protection under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act that potentially superseded archaeological access rights. Federal personnel found themselves in the awkward position of trying to conduct research activities around tribal ceremonies that they couldn't legally interfere with, but that made systematic documentation and artifact analysis effectively impossible. Dr. Stevens' frustration with these limitations became increasingly obvious as his research timeline was disrupted by what he described as unnecessary tribal interference with legitimate academic investigation. His complaints to federal coordinators revealed the underlying institutional bias that prioritized research access over religious rights, treating tribal ceremonies as obstacles to scholarly progress rather than legitimate spiritual practices with their own legal standing. These ceremonial activities aren't authentic traditional practices, Stevens argued during coordination meetings that Maria overheard from her front porch. They're contemporary political performances designed to obstruct legitimate scientific research. Real archaeological investigation requires controlled access and systematic documentation that can't accommodate theatrical spiritual displays. The dismissive attitude toward tribal religious practices reflected exactly the kind of institutional racism that David Running Bear had warned about, providing additional evidence for legal challenges based on violations of tribal religious freedom rights. Stevens' characterization of centuries-old ceremonial traditions as theatrical spiritual displays demonstrated the academic arrogance that treated indigenous cultural practices as less legitimate than university research priorities. Elena Yaz's response to these dismissive attitudes was to invite additional tribal spiritual practitioners to join the ongoing ceremonies, creating a continuous presence of traditional religious activities that effectively prevented unauthorized access to the most sacred areas of the ceremonial complex. The spiritual occupation was conducted with dignity and cultural authenticity that contrasted sharply with the bureaucratic maneuvering and academic competition surrounding the federal intervention. "We're not trying to obstruct legitimate research," Elena explained to Maria during one of the evening ceremonies. "We're maintaining the spiritual protections that these sites require to remain culturally alive and connected to our communities. Research that destroys cultural significance isn't legitimate, regardless of its academic credentials." The spiritual resistance was supported by broader tribal community mobilization, with members of the Tohono O'odham Nation and allied tribes organizing support networks that provided legal assistance, media coordination, and political pressure to challenge the federal overreach. Maria found herself at the center of a growing movement that extended far beyond her personal property dispute to encompass broader issues of cultural sovereignty and indigenous rights. The media attention that had initially been unwelcome became strategically valuable as tribal representatives and sympathetic journalists highlighted the cultural and legal issues involved in the federal takeover. Stories about government agencies violating tribal religious practices while claiming to protect cultural resources generated public sympathy and political pressure that federal bureaucrats found increasingly difficult to ignore. More significantly, the controversy attracted attention from congressional representatives who had oversight responsibilities for federal agencies involved in the dispute. Congresswoman Patricia Gonzalez, whose district included Maria's property and who had consistently supported tribal sovereignty issues, requested formal investigations into the emergency provisions that had been used to justify federal intervention without proper consultation processes. Federal agencies appear to be using archaeological protection laws as pretexts for asserting control over private property and tribal cultural sites, Gonzalez stated in a press release that was widely covered by regional media. Emergency provisions are supposed to protect cultural resources from genuine threats, not provide bureaucratic shortcuts for institutional research priorities that couldn't be achieved through proper legal channels. The congressional attention created political pressure that federal agencies couldn't simply dismiss through bureaucratic procedures, forcing them to justify their actions through formal hearings and documentation requirements that revealed the weaknesses in their emergency jurisdiction claims. The investigation process provided opportunities for tribal representatives and legal advocates to present evidence of procedural violations and cultural insensitivity that had characterized the federal intervention. Meanwhile, the unauthorized research activities that had provided initial justification for federal emergency action continued despite increased security measures, suggesting that the perpetrators had connections to the institutional personnel now controlling access to the site. Trail cameras captured additional evidence of professional archaeological investigation techniques being used by individuals who possessed detailed knowledge of site layout and security arrangements. Eduardo's analysis of the latest unauthorized activities revealed sophisticated coordination between multiple research teams who were conducting systematic documentation efforts during shift changes and other periods when official security coverage was temporarily reduced. "These aren't random trespassers or amateur treasure hunters," he reported to Maria and tribal security personnel. "This is organized institutional research being conducted without proper authorization, probably by the same people who are publicly claiming to protect the site from unauthorized access. The evidence of ongoing institutional violations, while federal agencies claimed protective jurisdiction, provided additional support for legal challenges and congressional investigations. If the very institutions asserting control over the ceremonial site were responsible for the unauthorized activities they claimed to be preventing, then the entire emergency intervention was based on deliberately manufactured justifications. James Antone's coordination with tribal law enforcement networks had identified similar patterns at other significant archaeological sites throughout the Southwest, where federal agencies and academic institutions had used various pretexts to assert control over discoveries that tribal communities claimed under cultural sovereignty rights. The systematic nature of these institutional strategies suggested coordinated efforts to bypass tribal consultation requirements whenever major cultural discoveries were involved. This is part of a broader pattern of institutional strategies for asserting control over Native American cultural heritage, Antone explained during a strategy meeting with tribal attorneys and congressional staff members investigating the federal overreach. Agencies create or exploit emergency situations to justify jurisdictional claims that couldn't be obtained through proper legal processes that require genuine tribal consultation and consent. The revelation that Maria's situation was part of systematic institutional practices rather than isolated bureaucratic overreach transformed her personal struggle into a test case for broader tribal sovereignty rights and property owner protections against federal agency abuse. The outcome of her legal challenges would establish precedents affecting similar situations throughout Native American communities in the Southwest, and potentially other regions where significant cultural discoveries occurred on private land. As Maria sat in her kitchen that evening, reviewing legal documents while listening to traditional songs being performed at the ongoing ceremonies outside her window, she realized that her simple desire for affordable housing had connected her family to historical and political currents that would shape not only their personal future, but broader relationships between indigenous communities and the federal institutions that continued to assert control over tribal cultural heritage and spiritual practices. However, the federal overreach also provided stronger grounds for legal challenges based on violations of due process rights and improper application of archaeological protection laws that were supposed to balance cultural preservation with property owner interests. Running Bear immediately filed emergency injunctions challenging the expanded jurisdiction claims, while requesting federal court review of the emergency provisions that had been used to bypass normal consultation requirements. Meanwhile, tribal authorities accelerated their own protective measures, establishing continuous spiritual presence at the ceremonial site through rotating ceremonies conducted by traditional practitioners who maintained the cultural protocols that federal researchers had violated. Elena Yazzie and other elders began conducting daily sunrise and sunset prayers that reasserted tribal religious authority over sacred spaces, regardless of bureaucratic jurisdiction claims. The ongoing ceremonial activities created practical complications for federal research operations, since tribal religious practices had legal protection under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act that potentially superseded archaeological access rights. Federal personnel found themselves in the awkward position of trying to conduct research activities around tribal ceremonies that they couldn't legally interfere with, but that made systematic documentation and artifact analysis effectively impossible. Dr. Stevens's frustration with these limitations became increasingly obvious as his research timeline was disrupted by what he described as unnecessary tribal interference with legitimate academic investigation. His complaints to federal coordinators revealed the underlying institutional bias that prioritized research access over religious rights, treating tribal ceremonies as obstacles to scholarly progress rather than legitimate spiritual practices with their own legal standing. These ceremonial activities aren't authentic traditional practices, Stevens argued during coordination meetings that Maria overheard from her front porch. They're contemporary political performances designed to obstruct legitimate scientific research. Real archaeological investigation requires controlled access and systematic documentation that can't accommodate theatrical spiritual displays. The dismissive attitude toward tribal religious practices reflected exactly the kind of institutional racism that David Running Bear had warned about, providing additional evidence for legal challenges based on violations of tribal religious freedom rights. Stevens' characterization of centuries-old ceremonial traditions as theatrical spiritual displays demonstrated the academic arrogance that treated indigenous cultural practices as less legitimate than university research priorities. Elena Yazzi's response to these dismissive attitudes was to invite additional tribal spiritual practitioners to join the ongoing ceremonies, creating a continuous presence of traditional religious activities that effectively prevented unauthorized access to the most sacred areas of the ceremonial complex. The spiritual occupation was conducted with dignity and cultural authenticity that contrasted sharply with the bureaucratic maneuvering and academic competition surrounding the federal intervention. "We're not trying to obstruct legitimate research," Elena explained to Maria during one of the evening ceremonies. "We're maintaining the spiritual protections that these sites require to remain culturally alive and connected to our communities. Research that destroys cultural significance isn't legitimate, regardless of its academic credentials." The spiritual resistance was supported by broader tribal community mobilization, with members of the Tohono O'odham Nation and allied tribes organizing support networks that provided legal assistance, media coordination, and political pressure to challenge the federal overreach. Maria found herself at the center of a growing movement that extended far beyond her personal property dispute to encompass broader issues of cultural sovereignty and indigenous rights. The media attention that had initially been unwelcome became strategically valuable as tribal representatives and sympathetic journalists highlighted the cultural and legal issues involved in the federal takeover. Stories about government agencies violating tribal religious practices while claiming to protect cultural resources generated public sympathy and political pressure that federal bureaucrats found increasingly difficult to ignore. More significantly, the controversy attracted attention from congressional representatives who had oversight responsibilities for federal agencies involved in the dispute. Congresswoman Patricia Gonzalez, whose district included Maria's property and who had consistently supported tribal sovereignty issues, requested formal investigations into the emergency provisions that had been used to justify federal intervention without proper consultation processes. Federal agencies appeared to be using archaeological protection laws as pretexts for asserting control over private property and tribal cultural sites, Gonzalez stated in a press release that was widely covered by regional media. Emergency provisions are supposed to protect cultural resources from genuine threats, not provide bureaucratic shortcuts for institutional research priorities that couldn't be achieved through proper legal channels. The congressional attention created political pressure that federal agencies couldn't simply dismiss through bureaucratic procedures, forcing them to justify their actions through formal hearings and documentation requirements that revealed the weaknesses in their emergency jurisdiction claims. The investigation process provided opportunities for tribal representatives and legal advocates to present evidence of procedural violations and cultural insensitivity that had characterized the federal intervention. Meanwhile, the unauthorized research activities that had provided initial justification for federal emergency action continued despite increased security measures, suggesting that the perpetrators had connections to the institutional personnel now controlling access to the site. Trail cameras captured additional evidence of professional archaeological investigation techniques being used by individuals who possessed detailed knowledge of site layout and security arrangements. Eduardo's analysis of the latest unauthorized activities revealed sophisticated coordination between multiple research teams who were conducting systematic documentation efforts during shift changes and other periods when official security coverage was temporarily reduced. "These aren't random trespassers or amateur treasure hunters," he reported to Maria and tribal security personnel. "This is organized institutional research being conducted without proper authorization, probably by the same people who are publicly claiming to protect the site from unauthorized access. The evidence of ongoing institutional violations while federal agencies claimed protective jurisdiction provided additional support for legal challenges and congressional investigations. If the very institutions asserting control over the ceremonial site were responsible for the unauthorized activities they claimed to be preventing, then the entire emergency intervention was based on deliberately manufactured justifications. James Antone's coordination with tribal law enforcement networks had identified similar patterns at other significant archaeological sites throughout the Southwest, where federal agencies and academic institutions had used various pretexts to assert control over discoveries that tribal communities claimed under cultural sovereignty rights. The systematic nature of these institutional strategies suggested coordinated efforts to bypass tribal consultation requirements whenever major cultural discoveries were involved. This is part of a broader pattern of institutional strategies for asserting control over Native American cultural heritage, Antone explained during a strategy meeting with tribal attorneys and congressional staff members investigating the federal overreach. Agencies create or exploit emergency situations to justify jurisdictional claims that couldn't be obtained through proper legal processes that required genuine tribal consultation and consent. The revelation that Maria's situation was part of systematic institutional practices rather than isolated bureaucratic overreach transformed her personal struggle into a test case for broader tribal sovereignty rights and property owner protections against federal agency abuse. The outcome of her legal challenges would establish precedents affecting similar situations throughout Native American communities in the Southwest and potentially other regions where significant cultural discoveries occurred on private land. As Maria sat in her kitchen that evening, reviewing legal documents while listening to traditional songs being performed at the ongoing ceremonies outside her window, she realized that her simple desire for affordable housing had connected her family to historical and political currents that would shape not only their personal future, but broader relationships between indigenous communities and the federal institutions that continued to assert control over tribal cultural heritage and spiritual practices. The exposure of institutional misconduct vindicated Maria's resistance to federal overreach, while establishing new legal precedents for protecting tribal cultural authority and property owner rights. The ceremonial site was returned to Maria's control, with formal recognition of her hereditary stewardship responsibilities and tribal cultural authority over sacred aspects of the discovery. The resolution also provided unexpected financial benefits that secured Maria's family's future in ways she had never anticipated. The federal investigation resulted in substantial monetary settlements for violations of property rights and cultural sovereignty, while grants from tribal cultural preservation programs and private foundations provided funding for proper site maintenance and cultural education programs. Most significantly, Maria's ranch became the headquarters for a new collaborative program between tribal cultural authorities and sympathetic academic institutions that established respectful protocols for research and education activities at significant archaeological sites. The program served as a national model for balancing cultural preservation, scholarly research, and indigenous sovereignty rights in ways that honored all legitimate interests while preventing the kind of institutional abuse that had characterized the initial federal intervention. The ceremonial site itself was restored to active spiritual use through ongoing traditional ceremonies conducted by tribal practitioners, while selected areas were developed for educational purposes that shared indigenous cultural knowledge with respectful visitors who followed appropriate protocols. Maria found unexpected purpose in coordinating these activities, using skills developed through restaurant management to organize complex logistics, while learning traditional cultural practices from elders like Elena Yazzie. Diego and Mateo thrived in their new environment, developing strong connections to both their indigenous heritage and contemporary academic opportunities through educational programs that honored traditional knowledge while providing excellent preparation for future career choices. Their bilingual and bicultural education included both mainstream academics and traditional ecological knowledge that prepared them to serve as bridges between indigenous communities and broader society. The boys' natural spiritual sensitivity, demonstrated through their shared dreams and intuitive connections to the ceremonial sites, was nurtured through appropriate traditional training that honored their hereditary cultural responsibilities while allowing them to develop their individual interests and talents. Diego's fascination with desert ecology evolved into sophisticated understanding of traditional environmental management practices, while Mateo's artistic abilities found expression through traditional crafts and contemporary interpretations of cultural themes. Maria's own transformation was equally profound. The exhausted restaurant manager who had desperately purchased a foreclosed ranch to escape housing insecurity had evolved into a confident cultural steward who successfully balanced traditional responsibilities with contemporary leadership challenges. Her experience navigating complex legal and political situations while maintaining focus on family needs and cultural values provided skills that made her an effective advocate for other Native American families facing similar institutional pressures. The success of the collaborative program at Maria's Ranch attracted national attention from policymakers, academic institutions, and tribal communities interested in developing similar approaches to cultural preservation and sovereignty protection. Maria found herself testifying before congressional committees, speaking at university conferences, and consulting with tribal governments about strategies for asserting cultural authority over traditional territories and sacred sites. Perhaps most meaningfully, the resolution of Maria's situation contributed to broader changes in federal policy regarding Native American cultural sites and tribal sovereignty rights. New regulations required genuine consultation with appropriate tribal authorities and recognition of hereditary cultural stewardship before any federal intervention in archaeological discoveries, while expanded funding supported tribal cultural preservation programs and indigenous-controlled research initiatives. The weathered for sale sign that had first attracted Maria's attention 3 years earlier had been replaced by a beautifully crafted wooden sign that identified her property as the Maria Delgado Cultural Preservation Center, honoring both her maiden name and her children's surname while establishing their family's permanent connection to the land and its cultural significance. As Maria stood on her front porch on the 3rd anniversary of her desperate property purchase, watching the sunrise illuminate ancient saguaro cacti while listening to morning prayers, being conducted at the ceremonial site. She reflected on how completely their lives had been transformed by following dreams and intuition that had led them home to responsibilities they hadn't known they carried. The simple desire for affordable housing had connected her family to cultural currents and historical significance that extended far beyond their individual circumstances, transforming not only their personal situation, but contributing to broader changes in how American society recognized and respected indigenous cultural authority and spiritual traditions. What had begun as financial desperation had evolved into cultural homecoming, legal precedent, and ongoing purpose that would shape their family's legacy for generations to come. The ceremonial site that had remained hidden for over a century had finally fulfilled its purpose, preserving not just cultural artifacts, but living traditions that continued to provide spiritual guidance and community connection for contemporary Native American families, reclaiming their heritage and their rightful place in the landscape their ancestors had loved and protected. If you're fascinated by stories of hidden history, cultural discovery, and ordinary people whose courage changes everything, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Next week, we'll be sharing the incredible story of a construction worker who discovered something buried beneath a Chicago apartment building that connected him to one of America's most famous unsolved mysteries from the 1920s. Drop a comment below telling us which state you're watching from, and let us know if you've ever discovered something unexpected that changed your understanding of your own family history. Your story might be featured in one of our upcoming videos about hidden discoveries that transform lives in ways no one could have imagined.